Welcome to Last Breath Woodworks. I'm Josh. In this video we're going to be doing two separate projects. They're both vases, but we're going to be using extremely different processes for each. In this first one you'll notice I've just basically dug out a bunch of cut-offs out of my crates, and they're all different species of wood, three kinds of oak, some walnut, cherry, and I think there's even a piece of mahogany in there. And they're also different thicknesses, ranging from 3/8 of an inch all the way up to 1.25 inches. Now, once I had them all squared up and equal, I just kind of rotated each one so that the grain went a different direction, and then glued them all up. You'll see I've got just some MDF and plywood that I wrapped with packing tape to kind of help line these pieces up as I clamped them together. The next day, after the glue had dried, I just sanded off the little glue boogers and took it over the table saw, and a little bit at a time worked on cutting that block in half. Then I took those two halves, set them side by side, and then flipped the one side so that the grains wouldn't be the same from side to side. This is similar to a chaos pattern. I've seen a lot of guys make chaos cutting boards, and I thought, well, why not try this on something on the lathe? The next day after that second glue up was dry, I cut it one more time on the opposite side to get 4 separate sections in there, and then milled it down to 3.5 by 3.5 because that's all that'll fit in my miter saw. And I set the angle to 22.5 degrees and just cut a series of slices in it, all at different thicknesses. Once those cuts were all made, I then just kind of randomly reorganized them to change up that pattern as much as I possibly could. I kind of wish I would have made a couple more cuts. It wasn't as easy as it looked. Then once that was glued up and dried the next day, I just used the table saw to knock the corners off of that blank so that there wasn't so much material to carve away once I put it on the lathe. Now, after all those cuts were made, I was getting close to the amount of material that I needed, and you'll understand that later at the end of the video. So I made a little waste block and drilled a hole right in the middle of the size of a bamboo skewer, added on some 2-part epoxy, mixed it up good, then used the pointed end of that skewer to line it up with the center hole I marked in that blank to get it perfectly in the middle. Now it was time to dive into our second project. I started off with a chunk of walnut and a chunk of white oak, both 1.5 inches thick by 3 inches wide. Then just some painter's tape with CA glue and activator. I was careful to make sure I lined them up perfectly before that glue set. Then it was over to the bandsaw to cut a nice wavy line through both of them. The technique we're going to be using on this vase is, I think, what they commonly refer to as a drunken weave or a drunken pattern. I've seen it used on rolling pins a couple times, so figured why not give it a shot on a vase. With those pieces cut, all I had to do was simply and easily peel them apart and remove that tape and CA glue, and then flip-flop one side of it so that I had two alternating pieces. Now, the blade on my bandsaw was getting extremely dull, and even though I was careful, it still left some chatter blade marks and a little bit of drift, so I just used the spindle sander with 120 grit to give them each a couple light passes so that they would true up and mate together perfectly. With that done, it was time for the first glue up on this project in a series of many. I put a pretty liberal amount of glue on these pieces just because I wanted to make sure if there were any spots that didn't quite match up perfectly, I had enough glue in there to fill those voids. And I carefully clamped them together, making sure that they were as flat as possible and perfectly flush on the ends. The next day, I sanded the glue off of those pieces and then just repeated the process of bonding them together with the tape, CA glue, and activator. But this time, paying attention to make sure that the joints on the ends were perfectly aligned. Then it was over to the bandsaw again, but this time with a fresh blade. I proceeded to cut just some curvy, wavy lines crossways across these pieces, being extra careful to make sure that the blade didn't twist or bend or drift. Now, the important thing to remember here is that you need to make an even number of cuts for an odd number of pieces. Otherwise, this process isn't going to work out for you. Once I had them all separated and unglued, I just flip-flopped every other piece from one blank to the other. You can already start seeing that wavy or drunken pattern starting to take shape here. Once that was done, I glued them all together again, being careful to keep those joints perfectly aligned. Finally, the next day, I took them over to the joiner and set it as shallow as I could and just gave each piece a couple really light passes so that I had nice flat mating surfaces to bond these two together permanently. With that done, it was just a matter of gluing them together and making sure that all the joints on the ends and the sides were lined up perfectly. I did use a little CA glue on the corners to kind of help hold it in place while I got the clamps placed. After several days of glue ups, this thing was finally ready to put on the lathe. Now you can see that once I had knocked the corners off of this one as well, it actually fit into my chuck. So I was able to cut a tenon on the other end and then flip it around and get it centered again. Now my traditional tools are all dull, and I had been just kind of sharpening them by eye, and they're beyond repair that way. So I got a new sharpening jig, and I just haven't set it up yet. So I just stuck with carbides on here and started out with a flat to get it into round, and then switched over to a round carbide to start giving this thing some shape. Now it's not a very wide blank because I didn't want to use any thicker wood on the bandsaw and take the risk of that blade drifting and things not lining up. So I had to stick with a real slender but elegant form to it. And you'll see here I'm constantly stopping and checking that narrowest point or that throat to make sure that when I drill out the center, I have enough material left over. I was aiming for a wall thickness of 3/8 at the narrowest point, so those glue joints didn't have a chance of breaking. Once I had the shape I wanted, I just sanded the whole thing down from 80 grit to 220, making sure that I had any little nicks or tear outs completely gone and taken care of. With the steady rest installed to keep this stable, I just used an extension on my Forstner bit because these holes had to be drilled 8¼ inches deep. Now after I finished drilling the hole, I just tapered the opening or the mouth of the vase and then used a dowel and sandpaper to smooth out those inside walls, and then just gave the whole inside a nice little finish sanding. Now you can see here I started cutting the piece off part way so I could ease that bottom edge of the vase, and then I just sanded the thing all the way to 320. Now it was time for finish. I'm just using some homemade friction polish I made. It's boiled linseed oil, shellac, and mineral spirits. Start with the lathe on low speed and just rub that finish into the wood nice, and then crank the speed up, and that'll create heat and friction, which will evaporate the solvents and give this thing a nice luster. When that was done, I just parted the thing off and then used the same process to turn the chaos vase. Well, folks, they're done. Overall, pretty happy with the way they turned out. The chaos vase, you can see all the different offset woods in there and the curves, the angled lines. Came out really nice. I think if I ever do these again, though, I will do another cut opposite on that angle. And on the first cut, instead of cutting it in half, I might do two cuts to make 3 sections. That way it breaks it up and gives it even a little more detail. As far as the drunken vase, really happy with these. You can see how all the corners and the joints lined up really nice, and that was the hardest part about these glue ups was trying to keep that all true without them sliding around while I was clamping them. But while I was making these, I decided that since I have some spring markets coming up soon, I'd batch some out. So I made a half a dozen of the drunken vases and 2 of the chaos. And when I drilled these out, I drilled them a little deeper because I bought vases for these, and I went about 3/8 of an inch deeper than the height of the vase, so that way they drop in there, and when they're on display, you don't see the top of the vase sticking up above the wooden vase, because this way you can put live flowers in here if you want, for Mother's Day, Easter, whatever, any occasion, because you don't want to put water in these wooden vases. It'll swell the wood, blow the joints out. Same thing with these. I bought some flat bottom test tubes and drilled them 3/8 of an inch deeper so they sit inside as well. So I made 2 with the walnut and white oak, 2 with white oak and cherry, which they don't show up much now, but I know that cherry's going to darken. I made 1 with walnut and curly maple, and that one turned out really cool. And then 1 with walnut and cherry, which is really pretty too. Now, drilling these out, these weren't too bad, but these became a nightmare. And used an 1.25 inch bit, Forstner bit, and burned the snot out of it, so I got to get a new one. But I guess I can't complain when you figure I drilled 8.25 inches on each one of these. So when you add it up, that's over 4 feet of drilling through end grain and wood glue. So no complaints there. It served me well. I know I haven't put out a ton of content lately, but with these markets coming up, I've got a lot of projects coming, and I'll get a lot more out soon. So if you like what you see here, please like, subscribe, comment. Really helps the channel out a lot. And as usual, I'll put up some glamour shots at the end. Thanks for watching Last Breath Woodworks.